the previous Khamenei, the elder, the late Khamenei, I should say, took out a fatwa. I believe it was genuine. My understanding of what the Iranian government wants is they want to maintain their sovereign right to enrich uranium so that, if needs be, they can have a bomb. But they don't want to have a bomb because they've seen what happened.
But isn't that a large...
The entire tone of the debate changes when someone with real economic and governmental experience enters the room. During this remarkable appearance on Piers Morgan Uncensored, former Greek finance minister Yanis Varoufakis tore apart the case being made for the new conflict with Iran. Rather than getting dragged into the familiar cycle of outrage and emotional slogans, Varoufakis widened the lens. He traced the contradiction at the heart of Western nuclear policy, explained how the 2015 agreement was deliberately undermined, and exposed the recklessness of beginning a major war without any credible strategy for what came next, or even a coherent strategy for how it was supposed to begin, as others attempted to present the market turmoil, supply disruptions, and wider economic damage as unforeseeable consequences. Varoufakis made the opposite case. None of this arrived without warning. The risks were visible from the start, and the people responsible chose to proceed anyway. Before we roll the clip, take a moment to support the channel by liking this video, subscribing, and turning on notifications so you never miss another breakdown. With that said, let's get straight into it.
Of a new Cold War. Yanis, welcome to Uncensored.
Thank you, Piers. Thank you very much.
I've got three, we probably agree, I think, about the big picture here, which is, from what I'm looking at, this looks increasingly like a massive miscalculation by the United States, almost certainly pushed into it by Israel, who have a different agenda here, I think. But notwithstanding that, it's interesting when I've been listening to the various debates between the various factions, there are some sort of fundamental questions which are just worth asking you, and then we can get to the bigger picture. And they're these. Can we agree that the death of Ayatollah Khamenei is a good thing for the people of Iran and the world?
No, actually I don't. Given that it was a result of an assassination from the air by Israel and by the United States. Let me put it this way. Take it from the perspective of people in Iran who were opposing the Ayatollah, who were opposing the regime, who were protesting for years, since, remember, 2018, even before that, the brutality that was practiced, especially against women. What happened was essentially the regime was given a major boost, a major morale boost. It became far more legitimate. Because, you know, Piers, you and I have different backgrounds in the sense that I grew up in a very right-wing dictatorship. My father was abducted in the middle of the night by the secret police. My mother's brother was court-martialed. You know, people I know were tortured. Back then, we hated the regime in Athens in the 1960s, 70s. But I tell you that if any foreign power, the Soviet Union, Britain, you know, whoever, if they bombed us and killed the person we loathed, who happened to be ruling the land at the time, you know, we would have felt just awfully conflicted. Firstly, because we would be upset that the government, which we opposed, was given the legitimacy that goes hand in hand with any government that is being taken out by a foreign leader unlawfully. And secondly, because, you know, the supporters of the regime, and they were supporters of the regime when I was growing up, you know, felt justified, morally justified, to suppress us. So no, I don't think it, you know.
It's really interesting, Yanis, you say that, because I was mentioning last week on the show that I had a guy in a local cafe I go to in London who was Kosovan, and he had a couple of, it was his cafe, and he had a couple of Iranians came in who are not supporters of the regime, but mirrored almost exactly what you've just said, that the moment that their leader was taken out, that the country was attacked, that American Israeli bombs rained down all over Iran, that they found themselves instinctively wanting to rally behind their country. And he said he remembered the same phenomenon happening in Kosovo with Milosevic, that obviously not everyone, there were a lot of people that hated him before, during and after his life, but there were certainly a constituent of Kosovans who were very anti-Milosevic, but once NATO attacked, they found themselves rallying behind the country and therefore the the leader as well, which I think it's really playing to what you've just articulated.
Yes, and indeed, if you think of it now, suppose you are a progressive, even somebody who's left-wing and who opposes the government of the new Khamenei Jr. What is your choice really now as the bombs are raining down on you? Really, I mean, realistically. The choice is either this government, this regime, a system that actually works. Not very well, but it works. I mean, it's not Libya, it's not Syria, it's not a failed state. And Libya or Syria. You know, the alternative now is not some functioning liberal Western democracy or some kind of socialist paradise, which is, you know, my side of politics would have liked. It's a choice between a functioning government and Iran, which is torn apart, like Iraq was after the George W. Bush invasion. So, you know, let's cut to the chase. An illegal war that is brought by a foreign power, which, by the way, has absolutely no moral authority to talk about democracy in Iran, because it was in 1953 that the CIA and the United States overthrew the only functioning liberal democracy that Iran ever knew. So if you take into consideration, firstly, who it is that is supposedly bringing democracy by bombing the place into smithereens, and secondly, what we just discussed, the answer to your question is no, it wasn't a good thing.
The second question people say is it important, do you think, that a theocratic fundamentalist Iran isn't allowed to have a nuclear weapon for the sake of the region and the world?
Well, look, I am a very fierce opponent of nuclear weapons. I was, back in the time when I lived in Britain, I was a paid-up member of CND. So I'm never going to support anyone's right to own or to develop a nuclear weapon. But we live in a world where, you know, the West is so complicit and so duplicitous. On the one hand, you have Israel that has violated every nuclear proliferation or anti-proliferation treaty there is. Nobody's talking about the nuclear weapons that Israel has.
Well, they don't even admit having them, do they?
Indeed. So they've broken every rule and regulation. Nobody's talking about it. Now, Piers, I don't think that Iran wants to develop a nuclear weapon. I mean, the previous Khamenei, the elder, the late Khamenei, I should say, took out a fatwa. I believe it was genuine. My understanding of what the Iranian government wants is they want to maintain their sovereign right to enrich uranium so that, if needs be, they can have a bomb. But they don't want to have a bomb because they've seen what happened.
But isn't that a large leap of faith, though, in a regime which, I mean, at best, this is a regime, it may well be a functioning regime, but it's unbelievably repressive to its own people. I think it's undeniable that it has funded and provided arms to Hezbollah, to the Houthis, to Hamas over the last 2 decades more. This is a very unpleasant regime which has promoted terrorism around the world and terrorized its own people. I mean, let's not get too ahead of ourselves, surely, in sort of saying, well, actually, they're not that bad, so therefore we should trust them about the enriched uranium, which they're enriching at quite a rate. We should trust them about other areas of how they go about their business. Should we?
Well, let me answer in 2 points. With 2 points. The first one is you should never trust anyone, especially when it comes to nuclear weapons. You should trust and verify. But I remember the short stint I had in government, I also had the honor of having a brief discussion with Barack Obama in the White House. And this was in April 2015. I wanted to talk to him about Greece's debt disaster and our awful economic crisis. He didn't want to talk to me about that. He wanted to talk to me about how proud he was of his deal with Iran and with the European Union. Because that deal, you will recall, included extremely arduous verification processes. All the Iranian facilities would have been open for inspection by international inspectors. There would be cameras, there would be sensors, there would be everything that is necessary in order to trust and verify. So that's the first part of the question. Ironically, isn't it terribly ironic that if you think about it, the best that Donald Trump can get now is something like that agreement that Obama had already struck with the Iranians and the Europeans, and the Germans were really very, very gung-ho about it, including Angela Merkel, the chancellor at the time, and which then Donald Trump, the moment he was elected, not because he had any strong opinions about this, he just wanted to bring down anything that Obama had done, and it was a direct request by Israel. But the second thing I want to say, allow me, I need to say that Iran is the only country that has not invaded any of its neighbors. It was invaded brutally by Iraq. That invasion saw 600,000 people die in Iran. Chemical weapons were used with the acknowledgement of support or, turning a blind eye of the West. The Houthis, the Hamas, the Hezbollah, partisans, guerrillas, call them terrorists, call them whatever you want. I don't call them terrorists. That Iran did support, where they are, how shall I put it? They are movements that sprang out of many years of mishandling of the Middle East, let's put it very mildly, by the West. I mean, Hezbollah would never have happened. It would never have existed if Israel had not brutally invaded Lebanon in 1982. And then the Iranians supported them and funded them. Now, do you consider Hezbollah to be terrorists? Well, if you come from the Israeli side, yes. If you come from the Shiite population of South Lebanon, you consider them to be a lifeline. So, let's be nuanced about that.
But when you say, but Yanis, when you say that Hamas are not terrorists, I mean, what we all witnessed on October the 7th was 3,000 people charging over a border and committing heinous acts of terror against any civilians they could get their hands on, and some military, but predominantly civilians. They were kidnapping babies, they kidnapped Holocaust survivors, they slaughtered young people at a music festival, they were bombing, setting fire to things, and so on. This is surely the most blatant act of terrorism imaginable. Why would you not categorize Hamas, at the very least post-October 7th, as terrorists?
I consider those to be hideous and heinous war crimes. And there's no two way about that.
Why not terrorism?
Well, because you see, I have a problem with terrorism because, the IRA used to be terrorist until we had the Good Friday Agreement. And then they became partners in peace. Nelson Mandela was admonished as a terrorist when I lived in England. Margaret Thatcher, I remember calling him a terrorist. And then he became one of the greatest statesmen in the world. So I have a problem with the word terror, because you see the whole point about the hideousness of human endeavors when it comes to defeating one another is to terrorize one another. So I do believe in international law. International law is very clear. What happened, what you described, were war crimes. And I have no problem condemning them as war crimes. What I do not condemn, however, is an attempt by anyone, not just Palestinians, but by anyone, to escape an illegal fence around the open-air prison concentration camp that has been erected in order to deny them the human dignity. The whole existence of Gaza is not a country. Remember that. When they say, I remember when everybody was talking about the war between Israel and Gaza. Gaza is not a country. It was an open prison camp or a concentration camp that was effectively utilized in order to propagate ethnic cleansing and a slow genocide. So, of course, these are extremely delicate distinctions to make, but they are very important distinctions to make. I recognize the right of Ukrainians to kill Russians when Russians are invading Ukraine, right? I do not recognize the right of Ukrainians to kill Russian civilians intentionally. So we have to stick to the great success of the human spirit in 1945 of introducing international law, whereby we have very clear definitions of what is allowed in war. When is a people allowed to rebel against their incarceration, their ethnic cleansing, their abolition from the face of the earth? When is a war crime turning into genocide? Remarkable scholars, and most of them Jewish, did a lot of great work defining those limits, and we have to that, has it?
The third question people raise is, now the war is at the stage it's at, a month in, is it not essential for the future of the region, of the wider world, that Israel and the United States win that war? What do you say to people that argue that? In other words, the lesser of two evils.
Well, I'm sorry, that's the greatest of the two evils. Here you have an unlawful war started by Israel and by the United States. It's a criminal war. Anybody who tells me that the right solution to that is for the United States and Israel...
The gravest threat does not always come from the people operating the weapons. It often comes from officials who authorize enormous military commitments while having no credible strategy for what follows. Yanis Varoufakis was not simply trying to win an argument on television. He was exposing the machinery behind American power and showing how little control its decision makers may actually possess. That is precisely the kind of intervention mainstream political coverage rarely welcomes. A direct challenge to an establishment that makes reckless choices, then transfers the financial consequences to ordinary workers. His exchange with Piers Morgan stripped away the claim that this war emerged from some unavoidable moral obligation. Varoufakis returned to the history the public is routinely encouraged to forget. In 2015, an internationally monitored agreement already existed to restrict Iran's nuclear program. Inspectors had access, surveillance systems were operating, and verification mechanisms were in place. That arrangement was later abandoned, not because inspectors discovered it had become useless, nor because the framework had suddenly collapsed, but because political forces wanted it destroyed. Yet the people responsible never produced a serious replacement. Varoufakis reduced their strategy to its clearest form. There was no alternative waiting in reserve because there had never been a coherent primary plan in the first place. The result was an indefinite confrontation, with the country positioned beside one of the world's most consequential trade routes. Once Iran responded by disrupting movement through the Strait of Hormuz and threatening the circulation of oil and fertilizer, the consequences spread rapidly through global supply networks. None of that should have surprised the officials or media. Institutions now behaving as though the damage arrived without warning. The response was foreseeable. The economic pressure was foreseeable. What failed was not prediction, but judgment. Washington's decision makers gamble with the stability of the world economy, knowing that ordinary Americans, not the officials placing the bets, will absorb the consequences when everything collapses. The numbers reveal how reckless this arrangement has become. Television personalities with enormous salaries continue calling for escalation and an undefined victory, while the government supporting this permanent warfare system sinks further into debt. By May 2026, America's national debt had climbed beyond $38.9 trillion, placing the country within reach of a staggering $39 trillion burden. Even under that level of financial pressure, military spending remains effectively untouchable. The federal government approved approximately $849.8 billion for the Pentagon's base budget alone, with overall defense expenditures moving rapidly toward $1 trillion. Apparently, there is always more public money available when the objective is prolonging a conflict that has no clearly stated destination. Yet, when Americans feel the economic consequences at home, they are expected to accept them without protest. Petrol prices rising beyond $4.40 per gallon are treated as a necessary sacrifice. Families struggling to fill their shopping baskets as fertilizer shortages and shipping disruptions drive up food costs are told that questioning the policy amounts to disloyalty. Workers are being ordered to carry the financial burden of a war whose supporters cannot clearly define victory, explain the exit strategy, or account for what happens next. That is what made Varoufakis' intervention so damaging to the official narrative. He did more than outmaneuver Piers Morgan during a television exchange. He removed the appearance of competence surrounding the entire project. Behind the confidence speeches was no workable strategy, no credible route out, and no willingness among those responsible to accept blame for the economic destruction their decisions have produced. The public is no longer obligated to treat automatic obedience to the defense industry as patriotism, nor should the people overseeing national decline be allowed to determine how everyone else must endure its consequences. Varoufakis forced the establishment to confront an image it has spent years trying to conceal. A political and media class demanding sacrifice from the public while refusing to acknowledge its own failures. What frightened them was not merely his criticism, it was how clearly audiences could recognize the truth inside it.